Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their presence in the chamber? If so, the clerk will take the call. With 45 members in the chamber and a quorum being present, the Senate of Maryland is again in session. All right, we've got, the House was busy all day today, so we have a fair amount of work. We're going to be as efficient as possible, but we have a number of these bills from the House and some last-minute stuff from the Senate to get over or to either conclude entirely. So we're just going to go ahead and push right on through, and we're going to be as deliberative and efficient as we can be. So let's go ahead and start. We've got a message from the House, and we're going to start with 23. The clerk will read the message.
ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 23, 2021 RS. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order. Sylvia Siegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 23, Delegate Stein, Personal Information, State and Local Agencies, Restriction on Access, Maryland Driver Privacy Act. Shall the bill pass, notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
All right, Senators, House Bill 23 is before the body. Question is, shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Chair recognizes the floor leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. So the first two bills on the docket today deal with immigration, and I had the honor of attending a rally in support of these two bills a couple of nights ago, and I spoke to the importance of immigration and really the patriotism that is associated with immigration and immigrants, because we got people from all across the world that come to the United States not only because of who we are, but who we can be. They revitalize our nation, they infuse it with economic activity, cultural enrichment, and the like. It is literally the most patriotic act I can think of, even as a service member, is immigration and the process that we set up. And to that effect, the next two bills deal with reforming how we treat those that come here seeking opportunity and investing in our state and in our country. And so this bill essentially builds on some of the progress that we laid, and some of the foundations that we laid early on. So you'll remember back in 2013, we passed the Maryland Highway Safety Act, and that essentially allowed people to acquire a driver's license regardless of their immigration status, because we thought that it was not only a safety thing, but also something that would allow people to engage in economic activity, go to and from work, and support their families, and so on. And a year after that enactment, you had 40,000 Marylanders filed for that type of a license, and it's only grown exponentially every year. That information that people have enrolled in, their address, their photos, and their personal, their information is housed, and they engage in that program with the expectation that we would safeguard that information. So what this bill does is it augments the MPIA to basically say that any state or political subdivision has to deny a request from a federal agency for the personal information, photographs, any use of facial recognition technology, if it's going to be used for immigration purposes, immigration enforcement purposes. So that's civil immigration piece, not a criminal investigation, nothing tied to any sort of element of criminal activity. And so it mainly deals with the MVA, the Department of State Police, and the Public Safety and Correctional Services. So they're essentially, that's what there are two parts of it. One says, look, you're going to deny that request if it deals with the civil immigration enforcement. Two, there's another component that says, hey, you can't distribute that information to another entity if it's going to be used for those same purposes. And then third, it requires a report to be issued to the General Assembly saying, hey, look, how many of these requests were made, whether they were honored or denied, and so that we have that information going forward to make better decisions, and so we can see how frequent folks are coming into the system, into the Maryland system, and getting this information. One little thing to add, one little parenthetical thing to add is that if you have this NCIC access, It doesn't matter where you are in the country, you can access that information in Maryland. So you could be in Arizona, you could be in Ohio, and you could get that information. We are none the wiser. We have no data to understand how often that's our Marylanders' information is being accessed from across the country. So with that, Mr. President, I'd ask that we override the veto.
Thank you, Senator. Chair recognizes the Minority Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'll start with the latter part of that, of the floor leader's description. I don't think anybody here objects to trying to get more data on how often this is utilized, but I want to talk a little bit about what this bill does and why there's so much concern and why the governor rightly vetoed it. And I'm going to read a little bit, maybe paraphrase from his veto letter, and then talk about a couple of issues that I think the body should be aware of before voting on this override. House Bill 23 would impede important criminal law enforcement investigations by requiring the denial of inspection of certain public records, typically the MVA database, by federal agencies, unless they have a state or federal warrant. Limiting access to any database operated by state, local, or private vendors to law enforcement agencies removes the ability of our state's criminal justice professionals from being able to perform essential functions that keep our communities safe. This bill denies timely access to Maryland's database records for federal investigations. And it's not just going to end up being about immigration. It's going to end up about finding out where people are, comparing records, and figuring out and making sure that our agencies can talk together across these different government silos. They use this to help the federal agencies that we're talking about, use this to help locate people, cross-check background information, and find other details that are very important to putting together an entire picture. Now, why would we be standing up here? Because I myself am pretty libertarian in my perspective of how we should have a very limited government. But what we've seen and the lessons we've learned from past incidents in our country, particularly things like 9/11, were that there were these walls that were set up between our law enforcement agencies, our federal state partners, to where trying to figure out if someone who was suspected of doing something wrong was in the country illegally. If we set up walls like this as part of some sort of overall agenda about immigration, we run the risk of leaving our communities in grave danger when we're trying to, when law enforcement, particularly at the federal level, is trying to figure out what's going on and who is where and why. And it's interesting that federal agencies don't come in and really testify in favor or against legislation here locally. Sometimes here in the state, sometimes they'll come and give us information. They're never going to come and say this, but we know that being able to cross-check records across our MVA records, it gives these databases, it gives these federal and state groups from all across the country, it gives them opportunity to put together the puzzle of figuring out what's going on in complex situations. My friend from Montgomery County, the chair of JPR, just mentioned it could be somewhere as far away as Arizona or California or other places that could be checking, not just federal authorities. Well, oftentimes, states where there's more lenient allowance of driver's license are a place where somebody might go to get a driver's license that shouldn't be here, and then they may be involved in something that we need to figure out what's going on. Finding out their driver's license doesn't convict them of a crime. It just helps the federal authorities that are looking for somebody be able to figure out what's going on with them so we can find them and get to the bottom of whatever the issue is. The idea that this is going to be used in widespread dragnet for any random person who's here illegally is not really the way it works. So this is a short-sighted bill because it's going to put, again, reinstall some of the barriers that we've worked hard in the last 20 years to break down. And it's going to potentially make our communities much less safe. I don't think it's a wise move right now for us to be doing this in the state. Once again, as we'll say, as I've said ad nauseum, we understand the federal immigration system. There's a lot of issues with it. It needs work. But the answer to that problem is not having individual states watering down key pieces of laws and allowances that allow for sharing of information, that allow to be sure we know what's going on and we can figure out if someone's here illegally that may want to cause harm. And so I would urge the body, let's reject this override. Let's support the governor's veto. We can come back and work on the issue of making sure that we know how many times this is happening. I think that's a worthy goal to have data on what's happening. But this bill goes way too far. It will put our communities in jeopardy. We've seen this before. And I'm not trying to use one extreme example. There are many other examples where government agencies not being able to talk to each other and just get information on what's happening and who is where has led to big problems, whether it's terrorism or whether it's other types of community issues. So I would urge the body to support the governor's veto. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. All right. Any senators who have not yet spoken wish to speak? Chair recognizes the senator from the 38th District.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, HB 23, after reading the governor's veto letter, and we heard some quotes from it, I went back to the criminal justice professional, law enforcement professionals in my district, and asked them about specifically in the governor's veto letter where he talks about removing the ability of our state's criminal justice professionals from being able to perform essential job functions that keep our community safe. And the reaction, again, from those that are on the front lines, they point out that here we are, and I think this body is acknowledging this, violent crime is surging across the state of Maryland. Law enforcement in many areas has been defunded. There's been demoralization of our law enforcement with resignations across the board, if you look at those numbers since we've been in session last. And we have extreme law enforcement shortages across the shore, across the state. So the response from these law enforcement officials that are on the front lines, their reaction is it's foolish to obstruct cooperation and the sharing of resources and information. And one other note, it's been mentioned about September 11th. Some of you know that I was at the Pentagon on September 11th. I eventually wrapped up my federal service and came and worked in Governor Ehrlich's administration to help set up Homeland Security Organization. And what we tried to stress there was the importance of the integration at the federal, state, and local level, the sharing of that information to prevent such incidences, terrorist attacks from happening in the future. We talked about integration at the federal, state, and local level, and we talked about integration across state government. So it's disturbing to hear that we're moving in a different direction, I would say the wrong direction. So I will be supporting the governor's veto of HB 23 and urge my colleagues to take a look at the governor's letter and to think about the feedback from their own law enforcement officials back in their own districts. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any other senators who have not yet spoken who wish to speak? If not, the chair recognizes the floor leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I know we disagree on the fundamentals of the issue, but I do, and I hope we maintain this going on to the next bill, appreciate the level and the quality of debate not devolving into xenophobic or nativist rhetoric that I think was all too common in this debate in some other forums. So I appreciate that, although we disagree on the merits, and I hope we can maintain that spirit as we move forward. One point of just correction for, this doesn't have to do with law enforcement resources or funding, although I will just note that in our largest jurisdictions, Montgomery County and Baltimore City, for instance, the funding for public safety has actually increased over the last few years. So that's just not something that's a factor in this debate. But also for just a couple of corrections, this doesn't apply. If the activity is attenuated to criminal activity, look, you don't need the warrant, and you just merely have to click a button that says, hey, I'm accessing this database absent for federal immigration enforcement. And so this doesn't provide any sort of unnecessary barriers for information sharing, intelligence sharing, especially if you're going after someone that's suspected of criminal activity. So it has nothing to do with the two. One thing has nothing to do with the other. And therefore, there really is no component of public safety that's implicated through this bill. In fact, the folks, you look at the information around the state, most of the folks that are ensnared in this federal immigration enforcement activity are the overwhelming majority have no criminal past or no criminal entanglement. These are folks that pay taxes. These are folks that have jobs. These folks that have kids in schools. These are critical members of our community, and this is what we're doing. when we're allowing that type of access. So with that, Mr. President, I'll ask that we override the veto.
Thank you, Senator. All right, HB 23 is before the body. The question is, shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the chief executive? A green vote will be to override the governor's veto. A red vote will be to sustain. Any further discussion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote? Explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 30 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the majority leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 23. Said bill is returned to the House herewith having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. All right, next one, we've got a new message from the House on 16. Clerk will read the message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 16. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Siegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 16, Delegate Stewart, Correctional Services, Immigration Detention Prohibition, Dignity Not Detention Act. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 16, question is, shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote is to override. A red vote is to sustain. Chair recognizes the senator from the 34th District.
Thank you, Mr. President, colleagues. This is sort of a troublesome bill because what it says is that you can't house immigration detainees in Maryland. Doesn't say the INS can't detain them. Doesn't say they can't, pick up people they suspect of being here illegally. It just says you can't keep them in Maryland. But it's pretty elitist bill because what you're telling is the elitist advocates can say, hey, we won one. We got these senators kicked out of Maryland. The other side of this is they're still picking them up. So when you have a poor immigrant family who's living here in Maryland, whose dear relative has been picked up by the INS, they won't be housed here. You get to leave state. You don't just drive to the next county or down the road a little bit to visit mom or dad or sister or brother or aunt or uncle. You get to drive all the way up to somewhere in Pennsylvania or down in West Virginia somewhere because we moved them out. And for that, we're supposed to be enlightened. Look, folks, this bill, it's one of the flood of anti-police bills that passed this body in 2021 that were the brainchildren of some pretty extreme progressive advocates who captured a national hysteria on trying to control the police and micromanage. Anything with policing was evil and bad. And that was a political movement, not a public safety movement. And unfortunately, I think it was a movement that was really put the achievement of raw political power above the public safety, regardless of the consequences to innocent people. And with these bills, unfortunately, we sent a clear message to our police officers, the message that was demanded by the ringleaders of these bills, and that was that the elitist progressives, they know more than the police do about violence that plagues our city streets. That the legislature knows more about policing than the combination of all the chiefs and sheriffs and law enforcement in this state. It sends a message that we as a body don't trust the police, and that the police must willingly accept our abuse and disrespect or leave their profession because apparently we believed that we could easily replace non-compliant officers. And it was all great theater. Unfortunately, it was all very wrong. It was based on a grossly unrealistic understanding of the complexities of public safety. Ladies and gentlemen, the streets are violent. We need to support brave people who are willing to serve us, people who are willing to stand up and fight the violence. Because if we don't support them, we support the violence. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 8 months since we passed these bills, we've all heard here today the statistics. Crime has gone up dramatically in our urban areas. Some say that, hey, violent crime didn't go up in Baltimore after we passed these. There was no additional spike in Baltimore, so there is no causal connection between these bills and the violence. What really happened was violence in Baltimore spiked 7 years ago because Baltimore City adopted these progressive policing policies of not actually supporting the police. So it spiked 7 years ago and it's never gone back down. In the rest of the state that didn't adopt those, now we forced upon them those same policies, and crime is spiking. Folks, policing is tough. When we pretend that we're superior to the police in our character, knowledge, and experience, innocent people die. I'll submit we're not alone in our fault in this. The legal profession, my own profession, has through its elitism been softly or sadly complicit in unleashing this devastation upon this state. Sadly, the elitism of the bar and the bench has been confused for wisdom. Colleagues, I implore you to defeat this ill-conceived legislation and allow common sense to prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Chair recognizes the floor leader of the bill. Chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'll say this, I'll give you a brief description of what the bill does and then kind of tack back to some of the arguments that were made. I would just say, as an opening statement, most of what was just said doesn't apply to this bill at all, because this deals with people that are being housed for civil immigration, awaiting a civil immigration hearing. Civil, not criminal. And I think, my delegate said it best across the hall, is that this bill prevents us or gets us out of the business of profiting off of family separation. Again, these are folks that live in our communities, go to our schools, work jobs, pay taxes. Now, the bill has essentially two components. One is that it says, look, the state will no longer allow our jails and our prisons to be used for folks that are being housed for that civil immigration detainer hearing. So we're no longer going to do that. And then it says we are not going to subsidize in any way a private enterprise from coming in and doing the same. And then finally it says that if a private enterprise wants to come in here, we are not going to allow permitting or any sort of permit to go forward without first having a public and notice and comment period within 180 days where the public will get to say, hey, look, we don't want this, or we do. That's essentially what it does. And then the final part of the bill says, look, I mean, it enshrines the Arizona versus the United States Supreme Court case. You remember that came out of Arizona after Jan Brewer, the governor at the time, the same governor that wouldn't shake the president's hand at the time, basically put on the books a bunch of laws for stop and frisk and let me show you your papers. It says, look, we're not going to do that. We're not going to engage in that practice. It enshrines that into our code. That's essentially what the bill does. Again, this doesn't prevent law enforcement from going after folks that are suspected of criminal activity. Finally, I'll say this, for the piece that says, look, hey, we're not going to house them here, so where are they going to go? They'll go to another state or to another jurisdiction. Well, most of the folks that are actually in this process, there are other means, alternative means, a part of the incarceration that are used to monitor and ensure that folks show up for their hearing. And there's a remarkably high rate of appearance. So there's no failure to appear problem through this process. Most of the folks are monitored through some other means. So we should just switch to that alternative. We're incentivizing alternative means as opposed to incarceration. So at least when someone's awaiting this hearing, they can be supporting their family, educating themselves, contributing to our economy. So I think this is a very narrowly tailored piece of legislation that enshrines the very best ideals of what we are supposed to be as Americans, as Marylanders, and I encourage this body to override the veto.
Thank you, Senator. Chair recognizes the Senator from District 4.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I would say this, I give the chair credit, this is much better than the full-on sanctuary bill that was going to come out. It's much more measured than that. But it's still not a good piece of legislation. There's three things that it does. One is it basically attempts to prevent having private detention facilities in Maryland. We don't have a single one of those, so that's not really at issue. Two, as the chair said, it enshrines the Arizona decision into law that says you cannot enforce immigration on the streets. Local police can't. That's a nothing issue because no one's doing it. The Supreme Court said. The only thing it says is that the locals cannot detain, work with Immigration and Customs Enforcement to detain somebody. So why are they detaining people? Very simple. There's a crisis on our border right now. there are last year, or this year, there's already been 1.6 million interactions at the border. 2020, there were 400,000 of them. Put that in perspective, that is the most interactions at the border in the history since they started counting it in 1960. So when these folks come across the border illegally, what happens? They set up a hearing for them to come in front of an immigration judge. What do? They don't show up. When you don't show up at a hearing, you're then apprehended at some point down the line. A lot of times you're apprehended because you are committing another crime. And when you are apprehended, they want to get you in front of a judge so you can have your hearing. And at that point, if you don't detain the person, how do you get them in front of the hearing? With all due respect to what the chairman just said, their alternative means, these are people who have already skipped their hearing once. These are people that in many cases may have already come across the border illegally once, which that makes it a crime. And because ICE has 1.4 million people in a backlog, they are prioritizing more sensitive cases.
Senator, just a moment, please.
Yes.
Senators, if we could please, conversations can go outside. Senator may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. They are prioritizing cases where there are gang affiliation, where there are security issues. That's what they are prioritizing. So again, this gets into what we talked about yesterday. We are in a crisis situation of lawlessness and chaos at the border. We've never had chaos like this. And our answer here in Maryland is if you came in the country illegally, if you skipped out on your hearing, and then we just want to get you in front of an immigration judge, we just want to follow the rule of law, it's, well, we're not going to detain you, we're not going to do anything. Well, the practical reality of this bill, though, is they're still going to be detained, but instead of being detained in the state of Maryland, you're going to be detained in Kentucky or Tennessee or far away. So the end result of this bill is, this is a great bill, I guess, for social media, but as far as for the law, this is good for nobody. Because it's not good for the immigrant who is from Maryland and is detained and it has to go get a hearing in front of an immigration judge, is now, instead of being near his work, his family, his lawyer, he's probably going to be down in Tennessee or Kentucky, some state that didn't enact this and will gladly partner with the feds to take that money. So they're going to be there, and what does it do to our law? It further from Maryland sends a signal that we don't care about the law, that we don't respect the rule of law, and that when we have chaos at our border right now going on, like we've never seen before, the state of Maryland will say, hey, it's okay if you don't show up at your hearings. It's okay if you come in the country illegally, get arrested a couple more times. We won't even partner to make sure you get in front of an immigration judge. What a slap in the face to the rule of law. So this is a wrong-headed bill. Policy-wise, for those who are progressives and think you're doing something to help immigrants, you are not. You are sending these people hundreds or thousands of miles away. But I guess this is a great bill for social media, so I ask that we sustain this veto.
Thank you, Senator. All right, Chair recognizes Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. President. So every American family, save perhaps Native Americans, has an inflection point. And sometimes it passes without notice, but for my family, it's been important. The inflection point is when a new generation no longer knows someone in a previous generation who wasn't born in America, who came over by force on a slave ship, or who came over on a European steamer fleeing persecution, who came over on a plane as a refugee, who crossed the Rio Grande by foot. For some of you, that inflection point happened centuries ago. For others, decades. For my family, it's happening right now. My grandfather came to this country on a boat. He was 8 years old, the same age as my son is now. He knew no English, and he had no money to his name. I knew my grandfather, and like many members of the greatest generation, he was stoic about the hardships that he faced. It's snowing here tomorrow, and it makes me think of one of the stories he did share with me. He grew up during the Great Depression, and whenever it snowed, he would wrap his shoes with newspapers and secure it with rubber bands. And he not only did that as an economic necessity, for him it made perfect sense. Why would you buy boots and waste money if you could just use the New York Times? I knew my grandfather. I knew my grandfather, and I loved my grandfather, but he passed long ago. And so my family is now at this inflection point. My children are the first generation not to know someone who came over on a boat. And so I tell my kids about my grandparents. I tell them about the boat. I tell them about the Yiddish that I definitely could not understand. I tell them about the newspaper shoes. And I work hard to instill in them that our family came from somewhere else. All families came from somewhere else. And that's the greatest gift that America has given us. It isn't the material comfort, but the equal protection of her laws. So I mentioned my grandfather was a quiet man. I don't know how exactly he'd feel about the issue before us, but I knew him well enough that I think I can guess what he might say. Of today's immigrants, he'd say that they are us, and we are them, and that they too deserve the dignity that comes from a life free from discrimination. They too deserve to enjoy the protection of our laws. I urge a green override.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for sharing. He certainly would not have used the Baltimore Sun or the Washington Post. You know, it's just the Chair recognizes the senator, and thank you for sharing that in all seriousness, in all candor. Chair recognizes the senator from the Baltimore and Harford counties, followed by the senator from District 38.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the floor leader yield for a quick question?
Will the floor leader yield? Senator may proceed.
So my question is about the detainment. I understand the part you talked about, the fact you can't build a facility, but should somebody be detained by authorities? We still do that in Maryland, correct?
For what purpose? Yes.
Let's say somebody does a minor traffic violation, the police pull them over, come to find out the person may not have gone to their immigration hearing. Can they?
So if you're
detain that
talking
person?
about the 287G program, which I think three jurisdictions participate in, and the way they do it is it's just information sharing. It's not actually detention at this point in time. That's the slice of the 287G program that those jurisdictions.
But what do they do with the person that they have who's possibly committed a
If they're suspected of an actual incarcerable offense or something, then they'll detain them, for the period of time that's necessary to either ensure that they show up for their court date, or if they're a risk to public safety, then they can be held for longer. So there are a number of different factors that go into that decision. But yes, they are.
Okay. So I guess, thank you. So my question was, are we still detaining these individuals? So yes, we are. And the question is, what do we do with them? And I thank you for your response. I'm going to go on the
bill itself.
on the
Senator
bill,
may
Mr.
proceed.
President. They say if you're here long enough, you kind of see things in repeat. About 20 years ago, freshman in the House, I remember Governor Ehrlich was pushing a bill that called Project Exile. And this was a bill that dealt with, and I can't remember if it was an actual bill or it was a concept idea they were pushing, but it was all over the news. We debated it on the floor. And this is where you took violent gun criminals and you put them into federal charges. So they had to go to federal court. So if they were found guilty, they would serve their time outside of the state. You exiled them from the state. And one of the punishments with that was the fact that the family couldn't see them. And it was considered a harsher crime or penalty. And I remember hearing the debates in the House when I was there about how this wasn't right to the family. The person might have done a crime, but they've got young children and spouses that still want to see them. And just all the rhetoric that was said about how hard it was, how horrible it was to send somebody and exile them outside the state. And here we have a bill that's going to do this exact same thing to these people. We heard earlier about patriotism and allowing people to come to this country, and somebody might have gotten across the border the wrong way. They might not have came here with their parents, didn't realize what they were doing, and they're going to get caught up in this, and they're going to be sent out of state. And I think it's wrong. Again, 20 years ago, we fought this with gun criminals and said it was wrong. But here we are saying that, well, it's okay in this part, because we're not going to build them here, so it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's wrong, Mr. President, and that's why I'll be supporting the governor's veto.
Thank you, Senator. Chair recognizes Senator from District 38.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to follow up on specifically on the one-size-fits-all affecting all local jurisdictions. Worcester County, which I represent, is one of the three jurisdictions that does have one of the facilities. And I'm advocating for local control. And I wanted to point out, in this debate last April, I did stand up on the Senate floor and I offered an amendment to exempt Worcester County. And I wanted to point out the type of facility that's being run there. This is a facility that can house up to 200 immigration-related detainees. They've had the contract since 1999. And right now, before I came over to the session today, I checked, and there's 15 detainees. The facility in Snow Hill, Maryland, it's safe, it's secure. And I just wanted to let my colleagues know that we can manage a process like this. And it was just concerning that the legislation, the part that requires the termination of all immigration detention agreements with local jurisdictions, that we talk about this one-size-fits-all that doesn't work for all areas, and that there should be some local control, and that the discretion could be determined to engage in these local agreements should be at the local level. So again, I ask my colleagues as we go through these issues that this one-size-fits-all, and then you have something impacting a local jurisdiction where it's clear that we do have a safe and secure environment, a manageable program, and the impact that that's going to have. So I will be voting to sustain the governor's veto and encourage my colleagues to join me. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. All right, before the body, we have House Bill 16. Question is, shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? A green vote will override, a red vote will be to sustain. Any further discussion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote? Explain their vote. If not, the clerk will take the call. With 29 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 16. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland, by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is ordered adopted. All right, we've got 11 to go. Clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 114. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Seegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 114, Delegate Learman, Transportation, Maryland Transit Administration Funding and MARC Rail Extension Study, Transit Safety and Investment Act. Shall the bill pass, notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 114, shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote will be to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote? Explain their vote. If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
ladies, by the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 114. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. Clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 174. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Siegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 174, Delegate Brooks. Public utilities, investor-owned utilities, prevailing wage. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 174 shall pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive. Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone
Mr.
wish-
President.
Yes, Chair recognizes the minority whip to explain his vote.
Just to explain my vote, this was not one that we had necessarily said we were going to
Please.
talk about much. I just want to say this vote here, this is going to raise utility prices. I just think it's important to note that. We talked a lot about labor yesterday with another issue. This is going to make prices go up for working families and their utility bills. So just think that's important to note before we make the final vote, and that's why my vote is red.
Thank you, Senator. Any further senators wish to explain their vote? If not, the Chair recognizes the senator from Montgomery County.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This veto, us overriding the governor's veto, will not increase utility costs, but it will make sure that those people that are working on the front line receive a wage that's adequate, and will help make sure we keep people employed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. All right. Any further senators wish to explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 174. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. Clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 278. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Siegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 278, Delegate Feldmark, Economic Development, Job Creation, Tax Credit, Qualified Position, and Revitalization Area. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 278 before the body. Shall it pass? Notwithstanding the objection of the Chief Executive, the green vote will be to override, a red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 278. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. Clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 319. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Siegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 319, Delegate Polakovich Carr, Local Tax Relief for Working Families of 2021. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 319, shall it pass? Notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive. Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 30 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 319. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is ordered adopted. Clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 419. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Siegert, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 419, Delegate Chi, Economic Development, Advanced Clean Energy and Clean Energy Innovation Investments and Initiatives. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 419, shall it pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 419. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. The clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 719. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Seeger, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 719, Delegate Moon, Commercial Tenants, Personal Liability Clauses, Enforceability. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 719, shall it pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 719. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland. By order, Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. The clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 777. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Seeger, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 777, Delegate Brooks, Power Plant Research Program, Review of Application for Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity Alterations. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
The jackpot bill didn't make it to the House Bill 777. Shall it pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call.
yeah, I've read it from,
With 31 votes in the affirmative, House Bill 777's veto has been overridden. The clerk will read the message.
by the Majority Leader. Ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 777. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is adopted. Two to go. Clerk will read the next message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 894. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Seeger, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 894, Delegate Haynes, Education, Community Colleges, Collective Bargaining. Shall the bill pass notwithstanding the objection of the Chief Executive?
All right, House Bill 894, shall it pass notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
By the Majority Leader. Ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 894. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
Message having been read is ordered adopted. All right, last and final. Clerk, read the message.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, the House of Delegates has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 904. Said bill is sent to you for your consideration by order Sylvia Sigurd, Chief Clerk.
Message having been read is ordered journalized. Clerk will read the bill.
House Bill 904, Delegate Bridges, State Personnel Collective Bargaining, Exclusive Representative Access to New Employees. Shall the bill pass, notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive?
House Bill 904, shall it pass, notwithstanding the objections of the Chief Executive? Green vote to override, red vote to sustain. Any discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President?
Has everyone recorded their vote? Anyone wish to change their vote, explain their vote? If not, the clerk will take the call. With 31 votes in the affirmative, the governor's veto is overridden. The clerk will read the message.
By the Majority Leader, ladies and gentlemen of the House of Delegates, the Senate of Maryland has voted to override the governor's veto of House Bill 904. Said bill is returned to the House herewith, having been enacted under Article 2, Section 17 of the Constitution of Maryland by order Nicole M. Alexander, Secretary of the Senate.
All right, message having been read is adopted. All right, well done, team. That was efficient. Yes, Chair recognizes Senator from District 33.
Thank you very much. I rise for a point of personal privilege, if I may.
Senator may proceed.
So in the gallery today, we have a gentleman that I'd like to point out to you. 23 years ago today, I was sitting in this chair, and Senator Marty Madden was the minority leader. He stood up and introduced me and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have very few true friends in our lives, and this is my best friend, Ed Riley." Ladies and gentlemen, in the gallery is my best friend for 53 years, former Senator Marty Madden.
Welcome, welcome. That is so funny. I did not recognize him, Senator. He's got that Santa beard, and I didn't even recognize. I can't see that far these days. We are hope all is well with you and family. All right. Lots of big work today. Thank you all. This was we got through effectively. Good day today. Most everybody is probably going to be able to go home. Check the weather reports. It looks like it won't be too bad, but we're certainly going to plow through, pun intended, tomorrow regardless. So timing-wise, it's probably going to be somewhere 11 to 10:30. Are we thinking tomorrow? 11 tomorrow for the floor, but we won't necessarily recess to then, but for everybody else, 11 o'clock. Tonight, I think there are going to be, we will hold open the possibility of a pro forma session in order to catch anything that comes from the House. So we will probably set the recess for 6:30 for the pro forma. But for everybody, that's 6:30 tonight. For everyone else, it is 11 tomorrow. 11 tomorrow. All right. Any questions there? Chair recognizes Senator from Frederick City. No.
We were just talking. Would you clarify that?
Yep. Sorry. So in our rules, we have the opportunity to do the pro forma session, which is just minority leader, majority leader, Senate President can receive from the other chamber, not conduct regular business other than receive. So should they be able to send something over, we would be able to receive it and send it to committee. And so that is what we'll see whether that happens tonight, hopefully. But everybody else, other than those three, 11 tomorrow. 11 tomorrow. All right. Everyone good? All right. Yes, Chair recognizes Senator from Baltimore County.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wonder whether the special redistricting committee is scheduled to meet prior to session tomorrow.
To be determined. At the moment, we don't have anything for them to consider yet. So if it does, we will, at the pro forma session, would announce the time for that. But potentially 9:30 for the redistricting committee, but we got to see what happens on the other side of this hallway first. All right, thanks for being flexible, everyone. Special session is very special. All right, let's do any other announcements before we adjourn? All right, we'll recess. Let's do a quorum call before we go.
Mr. President,
Has everyone recorded their presence in the chamber? If so, the clerk will take the call. With 45 members in the chamber and a quorum being present, the Senate of Maryland remains in session. Chair recognizes the majority leader.
Okay, Mr. President, I move that the Senate of Maryland recess to the pro forma session tonight and for the rest of the body, 11 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Without
Correct.
objection, 6:30. We will recess till 6:30. So ordered. Have a very safe and
Okay.
pleasant evening, everyone.